Hey buddy, so the REST architecture or RESTful services or REST API. All of us has heard about these words so many times, right? And you know what? We design APIs, right? We develop APIs. The one word which confuse even the experienced programmer, that is called REST. So we will dig into REST architecture, but the important thing, before we dig into all those concepts, we need to understand what is REST, that REST. So these are actually not four, they are actually three. So RE is on one side and ST is on the other side. So RE means representation, S means state, T means transfer. Now let's understand this. So RE means representation. Now when you deal with APIs and when particularly talk about the REST API, meaning of RE here is representation, right? So that means in what format you wanted to represent the data for REST API, either XML, JSON, text, HTML, etc., right? So representation means in what format you wanted to represent the data. Okay, now that RE means representation. Okay, the other is S, right? So S means state. Now what state actually means here? So the synonym for state here is data, right? So obviously when you deal with API, when you're designing the API, there is always the communication needs to happen, and that will happen through the data, right? Whether it's a request data or a response data. Sometimes people call it payload as well, right? Request payload, response payload. So that state here, it means data. Now T means transfer, for sure. How you wanted to transfer that state, that data, in what format, right? So this actually means REST. So I wanted to transfer the state data in XML form, in XML presentation, right? So that is the actually meaning of the full form of REST. Now I hope you're not going to confuse anytime, right? When you're designing API and you say I'm designing a REST API, what that REST means, right? Okay, now what REST architecture is? REST architecture enables you as a dev that you write, you design, you develop your APIs according to the industry standard, right? So now REST architecture actually talks about 6 rules. These are actually the guidelines. You don't have to follow the alls, but there are some guidelines when you are designing the API. When you are actually designing the REST API, you have to keep in mind that I need to write down my API, design my API by following REST guidelines, right? Otherwise you can design your API in any way, right? But REST give you 6 principles that you need to follow, and these are those 6 rules, 6 constraint or principle. So the first is uniform interface. What uniform interface means? Okay, the first rule, the first guidelines from REST architecture says that you need to design your API, the interface for your API, right? When I say interface, that doesn't mean that I interface, right? The class interface. No, that means the actual gate when your clients will access your API endpoints, how it should look, right? That is the actual interface. Okay, now maybe it may confuse. What we will do, let's dig into the Visual Studio and let me try to make it more clear. So when I talk about a uniform interface, I actually talk about your controller, your endpoints. When you are designing your API endpoints, make sure you are writing in a uniform way. So if there are 100 developers in the world, they are following the REST guidelines, REST architecture, all of those 100 people are designing in the same way, right? So that is why the uniform. Now how to make it that uniform interface, right? So when you are designing your API, right, make sure if you are fetching the data from database, make a HTTP GET call, right? And your endpoint, your resource. So when I say resource, it actually means the end path, the endpoint path, right? So since this is a user controller, over here you are dealing with one resource and the resource name is user. If you're working with employee controller or employee endpoints, employee is a one resource, right? So you can name it anything. You can call it endpoints, you can call it resource path, right? So the first thing will tell about which resource you are dealing with. So over here we are dealing with the user resource, right? So you see I made a comment here as well that I'm dealing with user resource. So let's back to this get API request. So when you are designing your resource or the API endpoints, for a get call to fetch the data from the database, right, or to provide the data to the client, you have to make sure you are marking it HTTP GET, right? And the path that should be, it should start with API and then resource name, right? Because over here I'm going to get all the data for my user resource, right? So I will only say, hey, API/user. So it will give me that all the user data. Now, when I need to just fetch one user, what I will do again, since I need to fetch, it would be my HTTP GET call, and over here I will pass the ID, right? And then I will go to database or anywhere, right? And I will get that data for that particular one user ID. But the end part, the resource path, how it should look like, right? While you are designing your uniform interface, it should look like API, then your resource name, and then what should be the ID, right? So if you are fetching for user ID 1, it should be 1 here, 2, then 2, right? So the last should end with for which resource, right? What is the individual resource, that ID needs to be here. So API user and then user ID. Okay, now let's say you wanted to add one resource. So if you are adding, it should be your post. The verb should be HTTP post. Okay, now over here, since you are adding, that means it is a new record, right? So you have to pass the whole user model, right? Your whole payload in request body, and then you will just hit the database. But over here, your resource, it should only look like API/user. Now, if you notice, it was here as well, API/user, API/user. Then, our client, our system, when someone from the client machine will make a request to our REST API, how our REST API will recognize I have to add the data or I have to get the data. So our API will identify, hey, what kind of HTTP verb I'm receiving, right? The request that we are receiving. So it will identify, okay, this is a GET request that, though it was API/user, but it was GET. That means I need to return all the users. And when you say, and when you come here over add, though it was API/user, but I am receiving HTTP post. So that means I need to add this user to the system. Okay, now let's go to the update. Okay, over here, so this is most confusing endpoint. While designing the API, you have noticed, when people are designing update API, they never use this ID. The primary key of your table or your endpoint that needs to be updated. They simply use user model, and from this user model, they say, hey, I need to pass user.id, right? I need to pass user.id. But that is a wrong practice. When you are working with your REST architecture, REST architecture says, hey, in a path, when you are updating, so it is also called manipulation, right? When you are manipulating. So when you are manipulating, that means you are talking about update and delete, right? So since this is an update, my HTTP verb should be put, right? And then which resource, what would be that individual resource that I needs to update? That means ID, the unique key of that, the primary key of that resource, right? And the path should be like API, then resource name and the resource ID, right? So, and the whole data that needs to be updated, that should be inside your request payload, right? So it will say, hey, I need to update this data for this resource, right? So that is how your endpoint needs to be designed when you're following the REST architecture. Now moving to delete. Delete, again, this is also manipulation work. So when you are dealing with delete, REST architecture says, hey, use HTTP delete as a HTTP verb. And then in the path, mention what resource ID you want to delete it, right? And then the path, it should look like API, resource name, and then resource ID, right? And again, you need to pass the ID and it will delete whole data for that resource. So when you talk about the REST architecture, the REST guidelines, they only talk about HTTP GET, put, post, and delete. But in Microsoft .NET, there is one more. Actually, it is in many languages nowadays, but there is one more that is called HTTP patch, right? So it should also look like same API, then user, then the resource ID, right? Only difference is it should be HTTP patch. HTTP patch is, it is like similar to HTTP put, but not same. In HTTP put, you update bunch of record. In HTTP patch, you just patch. You update few records, maybe 2 fields out of 10 fields, right? So when you're partially updating, use HTTP patch. When you're completely updating, use HTTP put. Okay, and one more thing. So it also says when you are designing your REST API, make sure you are returning this meaningful response, right? And that message should be user friendly or give the meaningful message when it reach out to the client machine or to the consumer. Now there is one more. Let's talk about the client server. Okay, now let me drag this diagram over here. Okay, if you look at this REST architecture, there is one more guidelines that talk about when you are dealing with REST architecture, make sure you are not following the monolithic architecture, right? That everything is tied at one place. Old days, when we were working with ASP.NET Web Forms, there was design and server side code, both were sitting at one place, right? So what REST architecture says that, your client code, your client side should be separate. And your server side, your resource needs to be sit separate. Look at this diagram. I have server, right? So I have REST server. On the REST server, I have different type of resources, right? Returning different types of data, right? So if you look at this is HTML resource, this is image resource, this is other resource, right? So all different type of representation of my state, right? That needs to be transferred. So this is my REST server. So all the server side code, backend side code, API side code. Now, all the different client, Android app code, maybe, your Angular side code, this is your iOS side code, all those code needs to be separate and all these codes will consume same REST API, right? So it could be in any form. So that is about the REST architecture. Now, the next guidelines. The next guidelines is stateless. Okay, this word actually also confuse a lot of programmers, and specifically when they start their programming career. So what stateless means? Okay, so REST architecture says your client and your server, both, they do not need to know each other, right? They should not have friendship. So REST architecture is against friendship, right? For example, if you go to any government office, right? Over there, lot of people are coming. People treat people as a client and government office as a server. Now, the server and client, they are not friends. They don't know each other. How server will know who is this person? That person needs to show some sort of government ID proof, right? That number, because server is stateless here. So when server scan that ID, that is how it recognize, okay, I know this guy belongs to this department or this family, let's entertain this guy now. So that is all about the stateless. Same, when your client application needs to get some data from the server don't know anything about that. Client request needs to pass some sort of security token, right? Maybe in the header, maybe in query string, maybe in the request payload, whatever form, but they needs to pass the identity, they needs to pass the state, and then server will identify that token. If that token validated, then server will pass some data back to client application, right? That is what the stateless means. So Rust architecture says you needs to be stateless. Client and server needs to be stateless. Next is cache. REST architecture also says when client is making a request to the server, there are some functionalities that could be cached. Maybe there is some data that we know that it is not going to change very frequently. So over there, it can manage the cache and send in a response that for how long server is going to maintain the cache for particular this resource, for particular this API endpoint, right? So server needs to tell client in some form of response for how long it is going to retain. So client can just reuse the same data instead of making a new call, because anyhow that server is going to return the same data for this amount of time. What is next? So next is layered system, and I'm damn sure every one of us are already aware about layered system. So when you talk about the layered system, that means REST architecture just guide us, hey, other than REST API that you are designing, the service, the business logics that you are writing, don't write everything within the same layer. Split into different layers. Split into service layer, presentation layer, domain layer, right? Repository layer. So use all those layers. Don't put everything over one place, so it would be hard to manage, right? Divide into smaller parts. So architecture like clean architecture, MVC architecture, maybe we as a programmer, we can use such architecture, maybe n-layer architecture or 3-layer architecture. Start using that. That is how we are making sure we are following the REST guidelines, right? So this is not on the resource side, this is behind the resource where you are writing your actual business logics. Okay, now the last, code on demand, but this is optional. You don't need to follow that. It is not compulsory, but REST guidelines saying if you want, you can follow that. So that means code on demand. So what it means? Code on demand, it means server can also send some sort of executable code, some sort of script back to client, where client can just copy that code and execute it. What it means, how it can happen. So server can send some code, our API endpoint can send some code in form of JavaScript, right? Or some sort of other executable code in a response. So client will copy that code and just execute. Okay, now I hope you understand what is REST, what is REST architecture, and what is API, right? And all these 6 rules. Okay, so that's all for today's video. I will see you in the next video.